Good afternoon, everyone. Myself Priya Rathod, and today's my presentation topic is journalism as resistance, Margaret Fuller, and the ethics of reporting in an era of fake news. These are my academic details and presentation details. This is table of contents. So my research question is: can Margaret Fuller's journalistic practice at the New York Tribune function as an ethical model of journalism as a resistance that challenges the commercially driven misinformation crisis in contemporary democratic societies? Hypothesis: Margaret Fuller's journalistic writing in the New York Tribune represent an early model of journalism as resistance grounded in rhetorical accountability, civic truth seeking, and effective sincerity. By rejecting dominant patriarchal rhetoric, prioritizing public service over commercial interest, and distinguishing genuine emotional engagement from manipulative spectacle, Fuller's journalism offers a historically grounded ethical framework that directly counters that profit driven misinformation culture and fake news economy of contemporary media systems. So let's start with introduction. Margaret Fuller joined New York Tribune in 1844 and transformed literary criticism into civic journalism. She connected literary discussion with political and social issues, including prison reform, slavery, and women's rights. Her journalism represents that the press should inform citizens, expose injustice, and hold institutions accountable. Fuller's Tribune practice under close analysis. Fuller's articles illustrate how journalism combines factual observation with moral responsibility. Her review of Frederick Douglass' narrative and her reports on Bellevue Almshouse demonstrate that journalism must engage with social reality rather than remain detached. Fuller therefore models the journalist as a civic advocate who exposes injustice and demands accountability. Fuller's Tribune versus commercial media's misinformation society. This table compares Fuller's journalism with modern commercial media systems. Fuller prioritized civic responsibility and democratic knowledge, while contemporary media often prioritize advancing revenue and audience engagement. As shown in the table, commercial media may produce sensational content rather than fact-based public knowledge. Rhetorical resistance, Fuller's feminist discourse. Fuller's journalism represents feminist rhetorical resistance. She rejected both masculine authority and traditional feminine submission. Instead, she created a new intellectual voice for women in public discourse. Scholars such as Colony and Gustafson show that Fuller deliberately designed rhetorical strategies to challenge cultural assumptions about women's intellectual capabilities. Ethics of truth, civic journalism, public service, and post-truth dynamics. Fuller's journalism reflects the ethical responsibility of the press in democracy. Scholars like Picard argues that democracy depends on reliable media systems. Fuller's work represents journalism as a civic infrastructure where factual reporting exposes injustice and tests democratic ideals against social realities such as slavery and gender exclusion. Sentiment versus manipulation, effective truth and clickbait economy. Fuller used emotion ethically through what scholars call activist sentimentalism. Emotion engagement strengthened her political critique rather than replacing evidence. In contrast, modern digital media often manipulates emotion through clickbait and algorithmic targeting, creating misinformation instead of civic understanding. The journalist as a outsider critic, Fuller's structural position. Fuller's position as an outsider intellectual enabled her to critique society more effectively because she was excluded from institutional power. She could inform, uh, she could observe social inequalities with critical distance. This information shows that independent journalism often requires distance from political as well as commercial authority in order to expose structural injustice. The limits of Fuller model as a counter argument. Despite its strength, Fuller's model has such limitations. Her journalism emerged in 19th century print culture, very different from today's media digital media environment. Scholars argues that misinformation today results from structural transformations in communication system that individual ethical journalism alone cannot fully solve. Relevance, Fuller's journalistic ethics in post-truth, post-commercial age. Nevertheless, Fuller's journalism remains highly relevant today. Her works represents that ethical reporting can challenge misinformation and strengthen democratic accountability. Her example supports a modern argument for media system that prioritize public service, independence, and civic knowledge rather than commercial profit. Journalism as resistance, Margaret Fuller's civic journalism and the ethical counter model to contemporary misinformation economic. The This slide represent its framework of journalism as resistance. Ethical journalism begins with factual truth, continues through the responsible witnessing and emotional accountability, and produces civic knowledge. When these elements combine, journalism becomes a form of democratic resistance that protects citizens and holds power accountable. The hypothesis is justified here. For Fuller's journalism successfully represents rhetorical resistance and ethical truth telling. However, the contemporary misinformation crisis is structural and connected to commercial media systems. Therefore, Fuller's journalism serves as a historical evidence that ethical public service journalism is possible rather than a direct procedural solution. In conclusion, Margaret Fuller's journalism represents a powerful example of ethical reporting grounded in truth, civic responsibility, and democratic accountability. Her work shows that journalism can challenge power structures and expose injustice. Although media systems have changed, her commitment to public service journalism remains deeply relevant today. These are my learning outcomes. These are references, and thank you so much. Now, questions are welcome.
So, Priya, my question is the crisis of fake news primarily a failure of journalistic ethics or a structural problem of the digital media platforms?
Yes, it is a structural problem. While ethical journalism remain important, misinformation spreads throughout the algorithm-driven platforms designed for engagement rather than accuracy. Fuller's journalism represents ethical practice, but contemporary solution must involve institutional reforms, media regulation, and public interest journalism models. Next question.
My question is, can artificial intelligence worsen the misinformation crisis?
Yes, artificial intelligence can generate deep fakes, automated propaganda, as well as emotionally targeted misinformation. However, AI can also support journalism by improving fact checking and investigative analysis if it is used ethically. So thank you so much. This is from my